mean, how do you ever really know something? By coming and spending 6 weeks in KamChatka, do I know really anything about it? It went way beyond just the opportunity of being the first Americans to travel there. People at home will think I know something about KamChatka, but I won't, really. But there are parts that I do know about. The idea started innocently enough. A canoe trip in KamChatka. I really wanted to try and catch one of those Siberian blue trout. I climbed a hill to look at an old abandoned radar station in Nome before I flew from there to Providencia. It was part of a chain of defense listening stations called the DEW line, and our early warning system of a Russian attack. It's abandoned now. The huge receptors are there. Their presence looms over the top of the mountain, pointed at the Soviet Union, pointed at KamChatka. What was it looking for? What could it really see? As soon as we left the ground, we couldn't see where we were. We couldn't see anything except the gray cloud. I felt my known world break apart the way the ocean does hitting the coast. I was a little nervous flying across the most heavily defended border on Earth. The Russian radar can't see that I'm just a nature writer fulfilling a dream. As a boy, I read a book called Tent Life in Siberia about the first Yankee exploration of KamChatka. Writing in the 1860s, George Kennan inspired me with descriptions of snow-capped volcanoes, exotic native people, and his canoe journey on the KamChatka River. I planned to retrace part of the route he pioneered. But first, we had to get to KamChatka. We were crossing the Bering Straits to Providencia, a small northern outpost similar to Nome. From there, we planned to use a Russian plane to fly south and west along the Siberian coast. KamChatka is a mountainous peninsula roughly the size of California, which projects from Siberia towards Japan. As we came to the coast, I got my first glimpse of this foreign land. It was definitely there, and it was definitely Siberia. What little I could see at first looked bleak and threatening. Behind the very stiff and very formal and very military guards was Vasily, who was jumping around up and down, so ecstatic that there he was, here we were. That made me feel I wasn't coming to a foreign place. I was coming to meet a friend. I met Vasily Peskov last summer when he visited Alaska. He is the Soviet Union's best-known nature photographer, and after 25 years hosting a popular wildlife television show, he's become a Russian folk hero. In arranging our exchange, he said he wanted to go on a river trip. I was invited to be his host because of my canoeing experience. What he really wanted was to see all of Alaska. For a man over 60, he was tireless, but something was lost in translation as far as his interest in rivers. Every time I mentioned canoes, he said to me, "Rob, you need to broaden your horizons, or you'll become a dinosaur." We saw a lot of Alaska and even flew into camp for a week in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. It's pure wilderness now, but the oilmen want to turn it into another Prudhoe Bay. Through all this, we came to know and respect each other, even though our views were sometimes different. His part of our exchange is to host me, an interpreter, and a two-man camera crew in KamChatka. Only someone with Vasily's influence could overcome the military secrecy that has kept KamChatka closed to all foreigners since the Second World War. He came up with a special jet to fly us the final 1,000 miles. Our route followed the ill-fated Korean airliner, shot down in 1983. Finally reaching KamChatka, I felt the same excitement that Kenan did after a month at sea. Vasily had enlisted the local hunting and fishing cooperative to help us. The hunters had never seen canoes like ours. Before trucking to the KamChatka River, we decided to walk to a nearby stream to check that the gear and Vasily would fit in the boats. I couldn't resist, as soon as the three canoes were down by the water, just picking up the paddle, pushing out on the canoe onto the river, and taking a few strokes into a strong current. And that was the first time an American paddler had been on a Siberian river since 1863, when George Kennan was here. And that was a great feeling. You need one of these, Vasily. Vasily was willing to let us broaden his horizon. He had never been in a canoe. I hope that he'll begin to feel comfortable over the next few days, but God, he scared me so much when he got in the canoe. He walked in it like you walk in a house. It didn't seem that he appreciated the delicate nature of a canoe and how easy it is to tip one over. Okay, don't go too far. Wait till we get out there. From Kennan's descriptions, the river doesn't sound difficult, but I was nervous about how Vasily would do. Let Andre steer.
Мы не стали трогать, потому что боимся.
They didn't touch it until...
Надо, наверное, положить эти самые.
The hunters provided a truck to take us to the river and watched as we tried to load up.
Like this? Yeah. They won't bang against each other. You gotta look fine. Rob, what do you think? I put it through an eye here, and the side of this thing shakes.
Серега, неустойчивые у вас конструкции.
Hey, Rob, you're on Russian roads. They say Russians should do the packing here.
Our translator, Andre, made it easier to understand their advice. Kennan rode mules to get over the mountains to the KamChatka River. We are using horsepower on KamChatka's only major road. It's several hundred miles of hard going to reach the river. Vasily wasn't sure how close we'd get to the headwaters or exactly where they were. But once on the river, it flows north 400 miles through the heart of KamChatka. We got confused. We left the main road. The next man we met was a Russian Air Force guard. This was a bad sign. We weren't supposed to see military things. Showing the way to the river, he led us onto an airstrip where interceptor jets take off and land. Vasily said, uh-oh, military bases were definitely off limits for us. We drove over the end of the runway into a field, went through a mud hole, and finally reached the river. As soon as we opened the door, the mosquitoes came in clouds. That's where we camped for the night. Next morning, as we crawled outside, we were attacked again by the insect Air Force. Vasily was ready to make the best of it, despite the bugs. But he got extremely nervous when the commander of the other Air Force came down to say hello. The one promise he'd made to the generals in Moscow was to keep us away from anything military. And here we were camped at the end of a runway. The commander looked surprised when Vasily told him about our plans to canoe the river. We gave him a pin with our expedition symbol on it.
This is very, very, very good souvenir. Не только комары, но и отличный сувенир.
Туда налетели, набрались они.
Instead of arresting us, the Air Force men gave us a gift of their own, mosquito head nets. They saw we didn't have enough to go around.
Я вам пошлю вас свои книжечки на память.
Залезть неудобно будет.
If you don't lose this, it will be like that. It's just.
I won't, thank you very, very much. Yes, I sit in here.
Yes.
This is the sound is down here.
Okay.
Okay. Here's the lens. Come in and look at the lens here.
Ah,
Uh-huh.
okay.
And then we turn it off over here.
Yeah.
Then it works for 2 minutes. Before loading the canoes, I showed Vasily the small movie camera I plan to use for my journal reports.
Robert, speak. Yes.
Robert, speak.
Oh, yes.
Vasily, down.
Ага.
Down.
Ага.
Now.
Мы сейчас находимся на реке.
Right now we find ourselves on the KamChatka River. Our first impressions are we're being eaten by mosquitoes. There's so many of them here that we're hurrying to get out of here as quickly as possible.
The stretch of river by the campsite looks great, but we can't see around the next bend. We have Kennan's description of the lazy pleasures of canoeing a broad, tranquil river, but only a vague map.
Yes, let's go. Way over the right.
Okay, you're gonna have to keep that line on this.
Watch it down. Whoa.
See?
Watch it.
Don't forget you gotta have line trailing, Andre.
Oh, God, there's one right there. Oh, God, wait here.
Uh-oh. We didn't expect this. This is like a jungle.
Straighten up.
Fallen trees crisscross the river. There are log jams around every bend.
Hard right.
As we travel further down, the strength of the current builds up, rushing through the logs, trying to take us with it. One mistake could be a disaster.
You gotta go to the left. Quite quickly to the left, Robbie.
If we capsize a canoe, we could lose all our film gear or camping equipment. Someone could be swept into the logs, trapped underwater, hurt. Vasily tries his best, but this is no place for a beginner who doesn't swim well.
I take it up, right up here.
When the river is totally blocked, we bushwhack, carrying our 1,100 pounds of equipment. I don't like places where I can't see what's around me. Here, I could be plowing my way through these tall ground floor plants, and on the other side of a few of them could be a bear. I don't like that idea. We've seen bear tracks on the side of the river that are bigger than any I've seen anywhere.
Well, there's more logs downriver. There's a couple of fast lefts and rights. But I think in an hour or two we'll be out of it and on the main KamChatka River. I hope.
Очень тяжело. Много комаров.
Terrible river.
Много
Very
деревьев.
difficult. A lot of mosquitoes.
Одно удовольствие, что вода чистая.
A lot of trees.
Можно пить.
The only joy we have is clean water we can drink right out of the river. Vasily, налево, Vasily.
Back paddle. Back paddle.
This is a mess. Vasily calls it a porridge of logs. As the river gets bigger, so do the log jams. Here we are, up the proverbial creek. What is building up in my mind is the thought that maybe it isn't going to be just one day of this. Maybe we are going to have 2 weeks of this kind of traveling. And I am really anxious. In 7 hours, we have gone less than 2 miles. Hacking out a campsite seems the smart thing to do. We need to get in a tent away from the bugs and figure out a plan.
Я бы сказал нет, но я сам не был на ней.
If I'd been on this river, I would have said no right away, but I'd only heard of it.
Yeah, well, me too. If I had been on this river, I would say no. We need to establish where we are and what lies ahead, either by walking down the river, as you suggest, or by going out to the road. So your idea of going down the river is a good idea. But for us to put our equipment...
Моя идея сейчас сделать разведку.
My idea is just to scout it.
Fine, it's a good idea. But I'm giving a little background to say that if we continued as we did yesterday, we run the risk of having an accident.
We found out the airbase commander had offered trucks to take us farther downriver, but Vasily had said no. He was worried about going near the airbase again and wanted to press on.
Guys are saying we shouldn't go down here.
You're
making a mistake.
This is the river from hell, Vasily.
Это адская река.
Ну, он хотел такого.
Well, that's what you wanted.
Он получил это.
And you got it.
We decided to scout ahead on foot.
Мы сейчас на реке второй день, и нам всем.
Today we're on the second day on the river, and to all of us, it's very difficult. Today with Robert, we went on a scouting mission. We checked the river for a kilometer downstream. Today we'll have some big difficulties.
We're calling this the river from hell, but we do like it, right?
Right. Okay.
You got mosquitoes all over your face.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Stop. Well, we made our decision this morning to go a little bit further ahead.
Oh, yes.
We're going through two log jams to open water we could see, and if we could, if we ran into any more log jam, then we would stop and we would walk out to the road. But as we were coming through the second log jam, we saw people ahead down the river, and we think that we're through the worst of it.
We've finally reached the more open water, the fuller drive of the river. It feels great. Canoeing isn't Vasily's thing. What we have arrived at as a tentative solution is to have Vasily sit in front of me in one of the bigger canoes, facing forward, not doing a thing, at least during the tough spots. I gotta say, he's a very game guy for having come all this way with us to do something that he didn't even know could be done. This was the river Kennan described when he wrote, "It was sufficient pleasure to lie back, watching the ever-varying foliage of the banks, to sweep swiftly and silently around abrupt bends into long vistas." You could see the shape of these huge salmon coming under the boat just about 2 inches below the surface of the water. And these salmon had come from the beginning of that KamChatka River. They were as close as they were going to get to their spawning ground. They were in it. I was thinking today as we came down the river about the salmon which we've been seeing coming up the river to spawn and then to die. We've come across some of their bodies. That brilliant red salmon has been turned into silver. It had been picked over and pecked at, and it was dead. And I was thinking about how we focus so much on the living and the life quality. We tend to push aside from our consideration the darker side, say the part of dying. Well, there I am calling it the darker side. It's the other half of all that life around us in nature. If I were a blue trout, I'd be in a place like this.
Boy, it's nice to be on a Russian river today. The time we've spent now on this day is beautiful. No bugs, sun's out. We've got a lot of the distance between here and Milkovo done, and I couldn't be more happy about that. One of the nicest things about yesterday was coming into the shoal where we were going to camp, and all the gray and blue stones had butterflies on them that were gathering the last little bit of heat from the rocks. And as I took a step, there'd be hundreds of butterflies taking off. You couldn't hear them, you could just sort of feel the softness of their wings as they flew away.
Я не предполагал, что так можно быстро все это делать.
Vasily there.
Yes.
Making camp required a mixture of languages, but Vasily's English was way ahead of my Russian.
Now.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. That's okay.
Are you in?
Good. Hop.
Hop.
Hop. Hop. Hop. Hop. Okay. Oh. It is Indian fire smoke. Okay.
Hey, boys, what's for dinner?
Snow-clad volcanoes in the distance made mischievous landmarks. As the river changed direction, they seemed to float from one side to the other in a giant's game of hide and seek. We saw people in small towns now along the banks, and more signs of how people were using the land. This was second-growth timber. The original trees had been cut by prisoners during Stalin's time. We were approaching the town of Milkovo, where Kennan was mistaken for the son of the Tsar and treated like royalty. Vasily was instantly recognized, and as Americans, we attracted a lot of attention too. One of the interesting people we met was Misha Grigorin.
How long did it take you to build
А как долго вы
fort?
Значит, это год и 9 месяцев.
That took a year and 9 months.
Строил один.
He has reconstructed a quarter of an old Russian fort, part of the historical museum he runs here.
When did you think of the idea to build a church?
His intention now is to build a church. The Communist Party does not approve.
From the very beginning. Then during the period of Stalinism, everything was destroyed. And that's why my mission is to recreate these, to return the culture, 1,000 years of culture to the Russian people.
His hope is that through the preservation of the old ways, people will be able to remember where they came from.
Without this, we aren't a people, we're just a herd.
First Americans. And Russian land.
It's quite an amazing cultural contribution he's made. And he's actually been elected a deputy in the town now, a political figure, which is quite a different thing than he might have been a year ago or 3 years ago. He's acting in a very desperate game, because if the more liberal times don't continue, who knows what will happen to him. When I said something about that, he said he had learned how to survive a long time ago due to the years he spent in a concentration camp.
НКВД, значит, людей, кто, значит, ну, заступался за людей, убивал.
The NKVD was killing off people that stood up for the people.
Отца убило.
They killed my father.
Значит, нас Сталин издал приказ маленьких детей тоже сажать и расстреливать.
And Stalin gave an order for small children to be put in prisons
По
or
этому
shot.
указу мать
Based on this,
и 3 детей мы были вывезены в концлагерь на...
my mother and 3 children were taken to a concentration camp.
Мне было 8 лет.
I was 8 years old.
Сестре 6,
My sister was 5 years old.
А брату 6 месяцев.
And my brother was 6 months old. When we'll know
What
somebody.
was it like, though, for you to grow up in the camp?
Вы выросли. That's not important. The main important thing is that we survived, and I'm not angry with Soviet authority.
Я вырос в России.
I grew up in Russia.
Значит, да, и потому, значит, я делаю культуру России.
And I address the culture of Russia. I try to uphold it.
Значит, и мы ту историю, которая страшная
And
история,
that
мы
scary
хотим, чтобы она не
history,
повторилась.
we don't want it to happen again.
For Misha and his family's sake, I hope too it will never happen again.
Yes, Mita.
Vasily had told us that the military wouldn't let us paddle to the end of the river. He didn't seem too upset about leaving the canoes behind and climbing into a helicopter. He said, "Okay, Rob, it's my turn to broaden your horizons. You've got to see the volcanoes. That's really Kamchatka." Kamchatka's 127 volcanoes are a link in the ring of fire stretching along the Pacific Rim from Antarctica to Alaska. 22 of them are active, and the highest rises over 15,000 feet. They are totally unknown in the West. Vasily wasn't satisfied just to look. He asked a volcanologist to climb with us up Avacha, the second highest volcano in the neighborhood. I wondered if it would become the volcano from hell. We were climbing a steep slope of scree, very hard to get a foothold in. Rocks rolled out from under us, threatening those below. It was a much steeper and longer climb than we had anticipated. As clouds rolled in, I worried we wouldn't make the summit. But Vasily just kept going. We knew we'd reached the top when we discovered the bronze head of Lenin. and I noticed volcanic soot had tarnished the father of the revolution.
Wait till you go over to the other side and see that, Vasily. The clouds and the smoke.
Avacha erupted not many years ago, blowing out the cone of the older volcano. Looking into the crater, you couldn't see down very far because of the steam and fumes rising from the big vents. But when the clouds rolled away, there we were, thousands of feet above the valley floor.
Well, when the volcano is active, does it have a strong smell?
Ну, вообще, каждый активный вулкан, у него такой особенный запах, да?
Да.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Да. Have you been near an active volcano?
This is an active volcano.
Oh, yeah.
The last big eruption was only 7 years ago, but only Russians saw it because Kamchatka has been a closed zone. Vasily was full of enthusiasm for visiting the wandering Koryaks. He knew I would like them, and we flew north looking for these native people that Kenan had found in the tundra, herding reindeer, living as nomads, just as they had for thousands of years. I had to admit that the helicopter was an improvement over the dog sleds Kenan used.
Этого зовут Андрей. Этого зовут Роберт. Меня зовут Василий. Будем знакомы.
Сколько дней еще здесь будем?
Where would be a good place to set up our tents?
Так, где выставить палатки нам?
Уже рядом.
You can set them up right here, that's fine.
Uh-huh.
Space wasn't the problem out here. They seemed interested in having new neighbors. Kenan described the Koryaks as probably the wealthiest deer owners in Siberia. He said, "They treated us with as much kindness and generous hospitality as I have ever experienced among Christian people."
I was curious about your knives. You have two pieces.
Я заметил, у тебя
Do they have special jobs?
два ножа, у вас по два. А маленький для чего? One of the small ones to eat, and the big ones to
Для мелочей.
for small things. Он может посмотреть?
Ага.
Может?
May I see?
That's just for eating, for small things.
We dropped out of the sky on these people who have been just nothing but gracious in their acceptance of us. And I also realized they get a kick out of watching us go through our day, and we provide them with a kind of amusement I don't think they see every day. But it's been wonderful to be back in the tundra and to see the reindeer herders at work. We were just in time for the reindeer roundup. They do this each fall just before the rutting season. They needed to select out the bulls and saw off the sharp parts of their horns to protect them from hurting each other.
You're so close.
I wish, in a way, of all the places we'd gone to, that I could spend more time with them. Just by being with them and smiling and just absorbing the kind of energy that they have towards the way in which they live in this landscape. All the native people we've seen have a tradition of living as a part of this community of land, animals, and people. Vasily's next plan was to show us a part of Kamchatka that was totally untouched by man. Even in the time of the Tsars, the Kronotsky Preserve was protected for its special beauty and kept wild for its own sake. The director of this unusual preserve is Sergei Alexiev. He and his dog Ilka are going to be our traveling companions for the next 2 weeks. Sergei represents the new Russia and a commitment to conservation. I felt in his spirit a love of the land as old as Russia herself. Our first stop was in the Uzon crater, a volcanic plateau created thousands of years ago. The forces that shaped this are invisible, deep within the earth, but everywhere on the surface are signs of a weird, magical workshop where lakes steam, clay holes boil, and rocks float. Sergei led us on a hike out of the crater. The walk reminded me of Alaska, its openness and beauty. We were accompanied by small birds, the sound of little brooks, and the peace of wild places. We came to a divide. Behind lay the beautiful Uzon. Ahead of us lay the Valley of the Geysers. To be here in the Valley of the Geysers is to be surrounded by water. There's water coming down in the form of rain. There's water passing overhead in the clouds. There's water running downstream in the river that floods through the valley and sits in its deepest crevices. And the night we arrived, the water that fell off the cliff in the form of that beautiful waterfall that we fell into exhausted, but very happy to be here. The water was warm, but the geyser beside it was scalding. There are definite parallels between the valley of the geysers and the Arctic refuge back at home in Alaska. There's a pressure on the outside for development inside. There's the potential here for great geothermal development, as well as the fact that inside the preserve is one of the biggest natural gas and oil reserves in this KamChatka Peninsula. At home, we're fighting the same battle between whether or not we should develop the oil fields that lie underneath the Arctic refuge or keep the area as a preserve. All within a very short distance, by helicopter anyway, we are now at Karnatsky Lake. Here is another totally different place inside the preserve, a lake 15 miles across that is its own world. Vasily had arranged a little surprise. The canoes came, tucked in the back of the helicopter like large sardines. We'd be more on our own, free to paddle on the lake, poke around, and fish. There are definitely fish here, but nobody knows of a blue trout.
The lake is very young. He is only 10,000 years old.
The people that we've met are a most unusual family to find tucked away in a corner of this preserve. I met the wife first, Victoria, who speaks very good English. She is a linguist and a graduate of Moscow University. Her husband, Valery, is a philosopher, and here they are living in this very simple manner in the heart of nature. Now, this is the game. These are jacks. Can you say jack?
Or blue.
Throw them down
And the French variant?
on any flat surface in the ball. Now, you have to pick one up when you drop the ball. I tried to show Nadja the game of jacks because I thought that having brought my jacks to KamChatka, somebody ought to learn how to play the game. Wood smoke rising on such a warm day was a sign that Valery was preparing a special treat, a real Russian banya.
Russian juju.
This is what Kennan called the black bath of the Kamchadals. He wrote, "The hot stones radiated a fierce, dry heat, which made respiration a painful duty and perspiration an unpleasant necessity." He said, "I will not attempt to describe the number, the variety, and the diabolical ingenuity of the tortures to which I was subjected."
Okay.
Valery said there is no freer place in the Soviet Union than to be in his banya, in this preserve, in KamChatka. The volcano rises above the lake like some strange potentate. To be in touch with forces larger than myself. To be here seems to be at the center of all that moves and all that is still. To see rows of mountains like frozen waves, shafts of biblical sunlight. To be alone a few days. I wanted to let it all sink in. We flew from the preserve down the Japonova River, which runs east through an unspoiled landscape. The river splits and divides itself, a liquid connection between the land and the sea. We were looking for a fishing crew from Gazpromkoz, the cooperative which had given us so much help during our trip. The fishing foreman met us with a story he had to tell.
They want to build a hydroelectric plant on this river. About 40 kilometers from here. 50 kilometers. They're going to build a series of 3 dams. This would affect us at Gazpromkoz, because there would be no fish then. As soon as you put a gate on the path of migration.
His story had a familiar ring. Back home on the east coast of the U.S., we've lost our salmon fishery to dams and overfishing. Three years ago, when the head of the cooperative heard that bulldozers had arrived to build the dams, he flew to meet them. While he talked to the engineers, the fishermen quietly removed the starter motors from the heavy equipment and put them in the helicopter. When they said goodbye, they flew off with them. This provided time to talk to the head people in Leningrad to see if they really wished to build a dam and destroy the fishing. Luckily for both the fishermen and the salmon, the authorities changed their mind. By limiting their netting to twice each day, they let most of the fish get through to spawn. I hoped my blue trout had escaped the net.
Have you had a good catch over the years, or have you seen a change in the catch?
He seemed fully aware that if he fished them too hard, he'd put himself out of a job.
Where too much is caught, then you get smaller fish. And where there's a good fishing, it's run correctly, then it's fine.
When this work ends, will you be a hunter?
Yes, I'm a hunter. Look to the right, there's a fox in camp.
He picked up a fish and threw it towards the fox, which prompted me to ask him whether or not, in the wintertime, when he was a hunter, would he hunt the fox, the one he was being nice to today. And he said, yes, you bet. And I would like that fox's skin to be rich and shiny. But he, you could tell, loved to fish, and he loved that fox. We reached the ocean. I rose early. The sound of the waves jostled me. Something in the wide view reminded me of home. Kennan wrote, I sat quietly on the beach thinking over the adventures I had experienced. When I first saw KamChatka, it was unknown and mysterious, lonely and forbidding. Now every mountain peak is associated with some hospitable village. Every stream is connected by some pleasant recollection.
Василий Михайлович тоже готов. Но надо, Василий Михайлович, надо собираться, пока погода, и ехать.
At last we met Anatoly, the head of the hunters and fishermen. He's the man who challenged the authorities about the dams and won.
Значит, на этой лодчонке пойдете. Здесь каюр очень опытный.
We had heard that Anatoly knew KamChatka better than anyone else. He joined us here to bring us back to Petropavlovsk along the coastline. The border guards had said this wasn't allowed, but Anatoly wanted us to see the coast anyway. slide down the coast was something I couldn't get over. Here we were on the edge of that huge continent. The cliffs had dropped hundreds of feet down into the ocean. The water was very calm that day, and we were able to see killer whales and sea lions and a lot of the bird life scooting along the surface of the water or flying in myriad paths across the sky. We came into a beach with steep cliffs. Anatoly said this is where we would have lunch. He opened a small box that held bread, some tea, cups, and a knife. He took great pleasure in sharing this small ceremony in such a grand setting. Approaching the next fish camp at the end of the day, we could see they had the banya fired up and heating.
А в чем? Вязкий молоток возьми. А вон то не откроешь, не открой. Не знаю, давай.
The next morning, fog rolled in, and it started to drizzle. We wouldn't be able to go to Petropavlovsk by boat or helicopter, and there were no roads. Vasily and the fishermen had to think of another way to get us home. We never would have guessed what that way was. Even without roads, the local military could get around if the fishermen provided the fuel. This was definitely outside the experiences I had ever had. The tank ride epitomized the whole thing. I look back at Vasily, and for the first time in weeks, down in the deepest part of my soul, I let out a belly laugh I couldn't contain. I understood. It was so nonsensical, it made sense. A very Russian solution to our problem. Since we were actually traveling over the land in a boat, which is what these tanks are, I flew a yacht club flag. It all came back to me. The last 7 weeks in KamChatka, the people we'd met, the places we'd seen, so varied, so full of heart. Knowing them was the prize, the rare catch I'd been hoping for. Vasily was right. My horizons had broadened. All I had wanted to do was go on a canoe trip and catch a Siberian blue.